Good morning. Welcome to week 4 of the DRK March to May knit along Q&A. I'm going to jump right in because we have some longer questions today and I am hoping to get to all of them. So the first question is, I lose my knitting mojo in the spring/summer every year and I wish I didn't. Any tips on how to keep that up through the warmer months? So I do have a couple tips. It kind of depends on why you're losing that mojo. So it could be because you just don't really like having a lap full of hot wool during the summer, in which case I would say maybe go for some smaller projects. It could be a great time to get some of your gift knitting done if you do any gift knitting for the holidays, because you could work on small hats, mitts, socks, things like that that are really easy to carry around, that are little, so you're just keeping it in your hands. You might also want to do a project that you're excited to wear during the summer, so it could be a linen or cotton tee or tank, or a nice like lightweight shawl. I find a lot of times I like to knit shawls during the summer. They can get very big, but sometimes they're still kind of lightweight and drapey. A cowl like this, I'm wearing the Shift cowl today. That can be a really fun one. So I would pick projects that you feel really excited about and that spark joy. You might want to go for some brighter colors. Sometimes I find that my color mood changes seasonally. And I think for me though, probably my top tip on that is thinking about, depending on how big of a project it is, when you're actually going to be able to wear it. So I actually do a lot of sweater knitting in the summer because I want to wear them when fall hits. A lot of times we end up casting on our sweater projects in like September or October, but depending on how quick you knit, that might mean you're not going to be able to wear that sweater until midwinter, which can be fine. But for me, I start to get really excited. Fall's my favorite season, so I kind of use the summer dreaming of fall and knitting sweaters I want to wear when the fall rolls around. Especially transitional pieces like cardigans, or maybe I'm wearing Shifty, which has 3/4 length sleeves. It's a cropped sweater. It's something I can throw on over a dress. Which I really like, because a lot of times in the summer, depending on where you live, you're also going to get blasted with AC anytime you go in anywhere. So it can be really nice to have those transitional pieces that are easy to throw on and off. Again, shawls are great for that. All right, question number 2. You mentioned knitting around your kids and family, and I'm wondering if they appreciate that you knit around them, or if they ever feel annoyed that you bring your knitting with you. Sometimes people don't appreciate that I have knitting with me and I'm not fully present or focused. I adore it though, and it can bring so much enjoyment to an outing or activity to bring my knitting. Have you navigated this? So I have. I think that for the most part, the people that you're closest to quickly realize that you probably actually pay better attention when you have your knitting than when you don't. At least that's how I am. I get antsy. I have trouble just sitting around. Like I cannot watch a movie without my knitting. I just can't do that. And I need to be doing something with my hands, or at least have the option. Same with sitting around a campfire or when we're hanging out. I will ask a lot of times. I'll say, oh, do you mind if I have my knitting? And sometimes I even just actually articulate, like, it's a lot easier for me to focus and be present when I'm keeping my hands busy. And so I'll just say that. But I have found that the people that you're closest with get it. It might take them a little while to understand, but I think a lot of them do realize that it's just part of who you are. And I've actually had friends who bring it to places where maybe I would have felt like, I never want people to think I'm not interested or I'm bored with just hanging out with them if I don't have my knitting. But I had a great friend who always had it, and it was so natural and she was so confident about it that I don't think anyone ever questioned it. And I was like, oh, you can just bring it. But if you're ever concerned, you can always A, ask, hey, do you mind if I have my knitting out? And B, maybe just say, this actually really helps me to be present and focused. Keeping my hands busy just helps me out. So that's usually how I navigate it. My kids I've been doing it since they were babies, so they definitely it's just their normal. I'm trying to think if they've ever said anything. I think the only time they don't like it is if they want to snuggle and they feel like I'm not snuggling them enough. Like my son will be like, I want to snuggle you. But I usually just like let him get on my lap and then I put it around him and he doesn't mind. He just wants to make sure he still kind of gets to snuggle me at the same time. And yeah, my husband is great about it. I think he just knows that that's who I am. I have also heard of, there was another story I heard about somebody's spouse, they didn't have their knitting and the spouse even said like, oh, I'm like, I find comfort in you having it because they're so used to seeing them with it. So, all right, number 3, any tips for yarn substitutions? When you can't get a hold of the designer's original yarn or want to change colors beyond what's offered, what qualities in a yarn do you look for to still mimic the drape, squishiness, stretch, overall fit, and purpose of a design? So yarn substitution is a big topic and there's whole books written on it. I think if it's something you're interested in, reading some of those books would be great. You could just Google it. But in general, the best way to know if your yarn substitution is going to work out is to swatch. So the main times I would be wary of a yarn sub would be if the project was worked in, let's say, a non-superwash wool and you want to sub in like bamboo or another fiber. Like bamboo is known for growing. It really grows a lot lengthwise. A lot of the plant fiber yarns, so linen, cotton, those don't have quite the memory as wool. It's not as elastic and they have a lot of drape. They tend to grow. So only by swatching and then washing that swatch and letting it dry will you see what that fabric's gonna do. Now, sometimes you can be really flexible with what that fabric does. If it's a shawl, you want drape. You can really be playful with that. But if it's a sweater, that's where you need to be careful. Even just substituting a superwash wool for a non-superwash wool, you're gonna have changes that really impact the final product. So for instance, superwash is, again, it doesn't have the elasticity and the bounce back of a non-superwash wool. So it's gonna grow quite significantly compared to a non-superwash, especially in length. It's also can affect your hems. So cuff, the bottom of the sweater, even the collar, but I find it tends to be more in the hem and the cuff that I notice it, where the ribbing might blow out a little more and not have quite the bounce back. So you might want to actually go down like an extra needle size in those areas where you need a little more bounce back. But practicing and swatching are gonna be what gives you those skills to substitute with confidence. I think you have to go beyond reading about it and really applying it. The more swatches you knit, the more yarns you play with, the more you're gonna learn for yourself what fabrics you like, how they drape, how they feel against your skin, and how they act in different garments. So you might find that you love a superwash yarn for a shawl because it needs drape. It works out really well, but maybe you don't love it quite as much for a sweater. Or maybe your skin is sensitive to wool, and so you find you can do a little bit of wool, but you like it to be blended with cotton. I think that's a really nice blend. And so just playing around with those and swatching. If you have some yarn already in your stash, I highly recommend just going and knitting a 4x4 or a 6x6 swatch. It can just be even stockinette, washing them, letting them dry, see what happens to that yarn. Does it bloom and fill in beautifully? Does it grow? Do you notice a lot more drape? I mean, the amount of change you can see before and after blocking something can be massive. So I really think it comes down to just trying it out and seeing what you like and what works for your lifestyle. But yeah, I would say as far as what to look for, definitely consider how you're gonna wear the finished project Is it going to be okay if it has a lot of drape and movement, or does it need to have more memory and bounce back? And just, can you get gauge? If you can get gauge, try it. See what you think. At the end of the day, the worst that can happen is you tear it out. You can still use that yarn again. So I think that's been one of the most helpful things for me, is just trying things out. That's also just how I learn. I have to do it. I have to like have it in my hands and see if it works. That's how I design. I can't picture the finished item that well without actually playing with it and seeing what happens and seeing if I enjoy the process of it. That's kind of how my brain works. But definitely you need to get gauge and consider how it's going to wear on your body and how much wiggle room you have with that, if it needs to fit really well, or if drape and variations that way are okay. My brain does not work to read a chart. I can follow written patterns. Why are all patterns not written? I think this is a great question, because I get this one a lot. I'll get a lot of people emailing saying, I don't read charts. Is there any way you can write this pattern out? And I totally understand that. I actually, early on in some of my first patterns, I did write it out. The reason it's not typically written out, depending on the pattern, when you start getting into more complicated lace and cable patterns, the amount of space it would take to write all that out is just, it's actually going to end up being harder to read and feeling more complicated. Especially like something with color work needs to be charted. So I am going to link, Tin Can Knits did a great blog post on this very topic so that you can start to learn how to read a chart. It can feel really intimidating when you are looking, especially at a big chart with a lot of symbols. It can feel overwhelming if you are not used to reading charts. But I think if you start with a small basic chart and practice, it gets easier over time. But for me, I believe that the main reason patterns are charted instead of being completely written out is 1, space, and 2, it's going to overcomplicate it by trying to write that all out in text. Also, charts are a universal language. So charts, no matter the language you speak, tend to be something that anybody can then look at and knit from. So it's a matter of learning the symbols, and I think once you get used to that, just like kind of like getting used to abbreviations in knitting patterns, it does become easier. But I would start simple, something with a small chart, and just getting used to reading them. So a couple basic tips would be that when you're reading a chart, I wish I had one right here. I was just looking around, but I don't have anything on my desk right now. So when you're reading a chart, you're gonna start, if it's on the right side, if there's a right side and a wrong side, right side rows, you read actually starting in the lower corner from right to left. And then if there's a wrong side row, you then read from left to right. So just going back and forth, just like you would in your work. And another way to think about it that I found helped me to feel not as intimidated when I was learning how to read charts, is to think about the fact that it actually looks how your knitting's going to look. When you kind of take a step back and you look at the cables or the lace or the color work, it's actually a picture of what your knitting will look like. And so that kind of helped me, because once you get used to visually seeing that, a lot of people end up finding it easier than trying to read the written word. But it can certainly be overwhelming in the beginning. So I recommend checking out the Tin Can Knits blog post, which is in the notes. And I'm sure there's more. If you did a little Google of how to read knitting charts, I bet you'd find some more great tutorials. You might even find some video ones if you find that helpful. But I would say just start slow and start with like a simple chart. All right, I still struggle to understand swatching for gauge. How do you swatch for gauge? And once you do it, how to change to achieve the correct gauge. So swatching, you need to swatch how the pattern tells you to. So for instance, if you are knitting a shawl that's knit flat, then you're gonna do a gauge swatch that's also knit flat. But if you're doing a project that's knit in the round, such as a sweater, you actually need to swatch in the round because your gauge will change, especially small circumference knitting. In general, I have found that almost everyone that I've come across knits tighter in small circumference, like a sleeve, than they do in large circumference knitting, like a body. So you do want to swatch how the pattern tells you to. I'm also going to link to my friend Andrea Rangel. She did a great post on swatching in the round. So if you're not sure how to do that, she gives a couple different options on how to do that. So I'll put a link in the notes. But you also need to make sure you knit a big enough swatch. So back in the day, I did not understand really how to swatch. So what I would do is I would cast on, I don't know, 20 stitches, and then I would knit about an inch, and then I would take my measuring tape and I'd be like, oh, that looks right. And that would be how I swatched. And then a lot of times my project wouldn't have the correct gauge. I didn't really understand why. So when we're swatching, doing what I just described is not going to give you your correct gauge because gauge changes. You need a bigger space to get that average gauge from. So I recommend doing a 6x6 gauge swatch because that's going to give you enough space. I'm just looking for my, oh, here it is. To put your gauge, whether it be a measuring tape or a gauge ruler like this, you need enough space to measure your 4 inches or 10 centimeters within that swatch without going over edges, because if near the edges, your gauge isn't going to be accurate. So you want to be able to measure within the center of your swatch. So cast on enough stitches to be able to measure within it. So let's say the pattern says that the gauge is 20 stitches to 4 inches or 10 centimeters. I would cast on at least 30 then to give me some space on either side. And then I would knit, or whatever the pattern calls for. You might have to actually do your gauge swatch over a stitch pattern, but it'll tell you that. But for this instance, let's say it's stockinette, I would continue knitting till about 6 inches, and then I would bind off. I would then soak it for 15 minutes, put it between 2 towels to get out some of that extra moisture, and then I would lay it flat to dry. Once it is completely dry is when you want to take your measurement, because that's what's going to give you your truest gauge. And I recommend measuring again as you go when you're knitting something like a sweater. So if I am knitting a sweater, I might just check it, because sometimes if something stressful happens in our life or really happy, even if you're just watching a show, during the more emotional parts of the show, you might tighten up a little bit and then loosen up. So the good thing is blocking is going to help wiggle out that variation a little bit, but where you might really notice it would be between, again, like sleeves and body. I recommend pretty much always going up a needle size for your sleeve, but you just want to check it and make sure that you still have your correct gauge that matches the body gauge of that sweater. And there was one more thing I was going to say and I've forgotten it. Cheapers. Yeah, I lost it. But most important thing, knit a big swatch, block it, measure once it's dry. Now, the other part of that question was how to change to achieve the correct gauge. So if you need 20 stitches for that 4 inches, let's say, but when you measure, you actually have 22, that means that your gauge is too tight and you need to loosen up a little bit. So you would go up a needle size. If you have less stitches, let's say 18, that means that your gauge is too loose and you need to tighten up a little bit. So you would go down in needle size. Now, let's say it's only off by like a little teeny bit, and changing a whole needle size is going to make you swing the other way. That's when you might want to consider using a different needle material. So sometimes just changing from metal to wood, but keeping the needle size, might adjust your gauge to be that little bit tighter you need it, or vice versa, going from wood to metal might loosen it up a little bit. So having those kinds of tricks in your toolbox to pull out if you're just a little bit off can be really, really helpful. But yeah, if you have any more swatch questions, ask them in the comments below. All right. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was helpful. And remember to pop any questions you have that you want to see answered here in the Q&A. I have noticed a few people asking specific pattern questions that they need an email response to. I can't really answer those here. I can't email you back from the Google form. So if you need an email response for a pattern support question where you have a really specific pattern question that you're working on, you can find our pattern support email on the last page of all of my patterns. So just go ahead and email that, and you can also find it on my Ravelry page on my website. So just go ahead and email that for direct support. So we respond to those Monday through Friday during our regular business hours. All right. Happy knitting, everyone. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you back here next week. Bye.